Hi everyone, in today's tutorial I'm going to go through the hormones of the posterior pituitary gland. Now the posterior pituitary gland is quite a unique gland because it's actually not made of epithelial tissue, it's rather made of nervous tissue. And so you may be wondering, how does this gland actually work? Well, the way in which it works is quite interesting as well. So if we were to draw the position of the posterior pituitary gland, it would look something like this. So this red structure here is the hypothalamus. And off this hypothalamus, you have both of the posterior and anterior pituitary glands. And as we all know, posterior means behind. So the posterior pituitary gland will look something like this, and the anterior pituitary gland will just be in front of it, like that. So posterior, behind, and anterior, in front. So there are two main hormones that are secreted, and secreted is the key word here, secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. These are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And you may see this hormone denoted as ADH, or another name for it is vasopressin. So, as the posterior pituitary gland is actually nervous tissue as compared to the anterior pituitary gland, it can only secrete these two hormones. Now, these two hormones have unique functions themselves. Just in a nutshell, oxytocin is responsible for the production and also plays a role in the secretion or lactation of breast milk. Another important role that it has is allowing for uterine contractions to occur in females. So when a baby is pushing against the uterine wall of the uterus, oxytocin can be released from the posterior pituitary gland and allow for these contractions to become more severe and more frequent in order to induce labor, and eventually the secretion of oxytocin ends when the baby has been born, because there's no stimulus that needs any contractions to occur, and therefore the contractions subside. So allow for labor contractions. Antidiuretic hormone, on the other hand, as its name suggests, is responsible for retention of water in the body. So essentially, this hormone has an indirect role in maintaining an appropriate blood volume level, because the retention of water means that blood volume can be higher. And it can act on kidneys and the bladder in order to allow for this actually to occur. Now you may be wondering, it's also called vasopressin, so what role does it have there? So antidiuretic hormone can also allow for the contraction of blood vessels. So essentially it can allow for the diameter of blood vessels to become smaller. So this is just a little bit of a background on the two hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary gland. Now let's look at these two hormones in particular and see how they are secreted from the posterior pituitary gland. So if I was to redraw that diagram here, I'll add in two very important structures that are quite important for the secretion of both ADH and oxytocin. These are denoted in grey and are called the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei. So we have the supraoptic nucleus and paraventricular nucleus. And the main mechanism that allows for the secretion of hormones out of the posterior pituitary gland is actually the presence of neuronal axon bodies that run from these nuclei to the posterior pituitary gland. So if we were to have the neuronal cell bodies present here, and when I say neuronal cell bodies, I mean the soma of the neurons, they would have their axons running from the hypothalamus through the infundibulum and into the posterior pituitary gland. This infundibulum structure that lies between the pituitary gland and hypothalamus is essentially a connecting stalk, and it's more so important in the anterior pituitary gland, but it's quite important in the posterior pituitary gland as well, as it allows for direct connection through blood vessels and neurons and axons to the posterior pituitary gland. So these neuronal axon bodies that run from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland are what actually allow for the storage and secretion of the hormones. The supraoptic nucleus is responsible for the synthesis of ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and the paraventricular nucleus is responsible for the secretion, or the synthesis, of oxytocin. So once these two hormones are synthesized in the nuclei, they essentially run along the axon bodies through the infundibulum and are stored in the posterior pituitary gland. And when the need arises, they can be released into venules. This method of release is quite important because it's a type of endocrine signaling called neurocrine signaling. And neurocrine signaling is basically when a hormone in this case, or even a neurotransmitter, is directly secreted into a blood cell in order to allow for the passage and the transportation of that particular hormone through the bloodstream. So there is a direct interface between the neuron axon cell bodies and the blood vessels, or venule in this case, that runs from the posterior pituitary gland to the rest of the body. And the same is the case for any of these two hormones. So, in conclusion, the posterior pituitary gland is quite an important gland in the body, as it secretes two main hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone, as we explored, is responsible for the retention of water, and oxytocin is involved in the production, lactation of breast milk, and allowing for labor contractions to occur. There are two main nuclei that are responsible for the synthesis of these hormones. These are the supraoptic nucleus, which is responsible for the synthesis of ADH, and the paraventricular nucleus, which is responsible for the synthesis of oxytocin. These hormones that are secreted or synthesized from the neuronal cell bodies in the hypothalamus are then transported through the infundibulum and into the posterior pituitary gland, where they are stored in these axonal bodies, and then eventually released into the bloodstream through neurocrine signaling to reach the rest of the body. These places for ADH, for example, can be the kidneys, and for oxytocin, for example, can be the breasts or uterus.